introduce John Ohlendorf, who is with Cooper and Kirk. That is a litigation firm in Washington, D.C. The Second Amendment Foundation and the Citizens Committee for the Right to Keep and Bear Arms have been very, very lucky to work with him and many others in the firm. They have added so much to Second Amendment litigation. The rulings and everything have been amazing. They are also my favorite lawyers to work with. So I would like to introduce John. His bio is with the QR code.
Thank you, Julianne. I don't know if favorite lawyer is a compliment, but I will take it as a compliment. One thing Mark mentioned, an important aspect of the Bruin decision was that it rejected the application of the so-called tiers of scrutiny in the Second Amendment context. And for the next 10-15 minutes, I just want to drill down a little bit deeper on what those are and why Bruin rejected them, and why I think we should be happy that Bruin rejected them, and why I think we should hope that the court not only declines to apply these tiers of scrutiny to new areas, but maybe works to roll them back in the areas of constitutional law that they do apply. So let's begin with what are exactly these tiers of scrutiny. So the tiers of scrutiny are basically just a set of standards or tests that courts have developed to use when they're hearing constitutional challenges to government action under the Constitution. It's usually said that there are 3 tiers of scrutiny. The most strict or the most stringent is called strict scrutiny. This applies especially in the First Amendment context and to challenges of race discrimination. And so if you go into court and you say the government is violating my right to free speech, then generally the court is going to apply strict scrutiny, and what that means is the court is going to say, okay, government, he says that you're violating his free speech rights. You need to tell us that you have a compelling interest to violate his free speech rights, a really important reason. And then if you can show us that this challenge government action or this challenge law is necessary to further that compelling interest, then his free speech rights just go away. We're going to uphold that law even though they do infringe his free speech rights because you have a really good reason to do it. But it has to be a really good reason. The next step down from strict scrutiny is intermediate scrutiny. There the government has to have not quite as good of a reason. It has to have an important reason, not a compelling reason, but an important reason. And it doesn't have to quite show that the law is necessary to further that reason or interest, that important reason. It has to show that it does a lot to further it. It substantially advances that important interest. The lowest tier, the third tier, and lowest tier is rational basis review. And there the government can have pretty much any reason to support its challenge law as long as it's a legitimate reason. It can't be our reason is we're trying to discriminate against somebody's race, or our reason is we don't like the speech that he's speaking. It has to have some kind of legitimate reason, and the challenge law has to be at least rationally related to that reason. It doesn't have to be a really tight fit, but it has to have kind of a reasonable fit. So importantly, as Mark mentioned, a big aspect of the Bruin decision is that the court refused to import these standards into the Second Amendment context. Just briefly today, I'm going to talk about why I think that is really good news for our Second Amendment rights, and why I think, to the extent we care about our other constitutional rights, particularly our First Amendment free speech rights, we should hope that the court starts to roll back the tiers of scrutiny in that area as well. And the first reason, there are 2 reasons that I'm going to talk about. The first is that these tiers of scrutiny, this whole method of analysis, is contrary to the Constitution's, I think, is contrary to the Constitution's original meaning. So that the prevailing approach to the Constitution on the Supreme Court right now is you want to figure out what the Constitution means, what it says. You look at what the framers thought it meant. You look at the meaning of the words at the time that they wrote them back in 1787, 1789, figure out what the words meant then, and then you apply that original meaning to government action today. And I think the tiers of scrutiny approach is contrary to that method of constitutional interpretation. And the first reason that I think we know this is that we can look at the time of the founding at how courts approached constitutional challenges and constitutional rights then. We all remember, right, from school that Marbury versus Madison, right, there were challenges to government action on the basis of the Constitution around the time of the founding. There were some even earlier than Marbury in the state courts. So the courts heard these same kinds of challenges that they hear today. They heard them back then. But they did not apply anything like the tiers of scrutiny. They didn't have any sort of balancing, how important is your reason for violating, someone's constitutional rights. They didn't do any of that. Instead, they basically did something very close to what Bruin says courts should do under the Second Amendment. They looked at the text of the Constitution. They said, well, let's try to figure out from the meaning of the words, the plain meaning of the words in the Constitution, what's the scope of the government power that it grants the federal government to exercise, its enumerated powers? And then what's the scope of the rights that individuals have that are guaranteed by the Constitution? And then you figure out, is this challenge government action, is it within the scope of one of the powers that's granted to the federal government? Is it outside the scope of one of the rights that's guaranteed and preserved to individuals? And if so, then it's constitutional. If not, then we strike it down. That's what the courts did at the founding. A great early example of this is this famous decision by Chief Justice John Marshall in McCulloch versus Maryland, which upheld the first bank of the United States, which was challenged on constitutional grounds. He didn't do any kind of balancing test. He didn't ask how do you really need a bank? Do you have a compelling interest in the bank? He just said, let's try to figure out what the scope is of the powers that the Constitution granted the federal government, and is the power to create a bank inside that scope. And that's really how the courts operated for over a century after McCulloch as well. And it wasn't really until the mid-20th century, 1950s and 60s, that the courts started to apply this compelling interest, this tiers of scrutiny type approach to the Constitution. And it's really an interesting history because the test, the strict scrutiny test, which is today seen as the most protective test, it developed in the context of the First Amendment free speech clause. And at the time, in the 50s and late 50s and early 60s, there were kind of two factions on the court in First Amendment cases. You had the First Amendment absolutists, like Justice Hugo Black, who said, hey, I can read the Constitution. It says Congress shall make no law abridging the freedom of speech. I think no law means no law. So if you have a law abridging the freedom of speech, then it's unconstitutional. He and a couple other justices took that view. Then you had the First Amendment minimalists like Justice Felix Frankfurter, who really wanted much less judicial intervention, striking laws down under the First Amendment. And it was really Frankfurter who, in a series of opinions, developed this idea that, well, even if a law does abridge the freedom of speech, if the government has a compelling interest, then it's still okay because that interest is more important than your First Amendment rights. He really developed this idea in a series pushing for a very narrow, watered-down approach to First Amendment cases. And then through a series of membership changes, the balance on the courts shifted, something we're familiar with today. And the pro-First Amendment factions on the court got a majority. And one of those new pro-First Amendment judges, Justice Brennan, kind of took up the task of articulating what's the new, more protective First Amendment test that we're going to develop to protect First Amendment rights. And he seized on this language from these earlier cases about compelling interest, and he turned it into a more protective test. And he said, well, compelling has to be really compelling. We're going to use this in a more muscular way. But he took kind of the same test that had been used to water down our rights and then set it up as the way of protecting First Amendment rights. So I think we can learn a couple of important things from this history that show us that this whole tiers of scrutiny approach is not consistent with the original meaning of the Constitution. The first is it wasn't used at the founding. We know how the courts at the founding approached constitutional challenges. It wasn't this way, and so that's a good reason to be pretty suspicious that this approach is accurately implementing the Constitution's original meaning and the original meaning of our Bill of Rights. And then the second thing is we know, in fact, how these tiers of scrutiny developed, and they weren't developed by justices who really cared about the original meaning and who said, you know, we've done some historical research, we've figured out that it's these tiers of scrutiny that actually capture the Constitution's original meaning. Instead, they were developed as a way to balance away our constitutional rights, which I think confirms that this whole approach is not consistent with the Constitution's original meaning. But let's say that you really don't care about the Constitution's original meaning. It's not, I think it's the predominant approach to interpreting the Constitution today. It's not the only one. There are people who say we have a living Constitution. Instead, you know, we should think about modern norms and standards when we interpret the Constitution. And I want to finally argue that even if you take that approach to constitutional law, the tiers of scrutiny still are pernicious, they're still bad law, and they should still be rejected. And that's because I think the tiers of scrutiny really lack the essential characteristic of law in that they are not capable of being neutrally applied in an objectively kind of verifiable or principled manner. And I think we can see this kind of by both parts of the, for example, the strict scrutiny test. So again, the first step in the strict scrutiny test is the government has to come forward with a compelling interest justifying its challenged law. But how do you figure out what exactly the interest is that the law is serving? This turns out to be pretty tricky because it turns out there's a variety of different levels of generality or different steps at which you can describe what the government's interest is. So let me take the so-called assault weapon bans as an example. My firm has litigated against a lot of these bans. And as we all know, and as Mark mentioned, there's no such thing as an assault weapon, right? These are semi-automatic rifles, usually sometimes semi-automatic pistols. They have certain features like a pistol stock or a bayonet mount that make them look kind of scary, right? They look scary. So the real function and effect of these bans on assault weapons, so-called assault weapons, is that they're keeping scary-looking guns out of the hands of the people where the ban applies, right? That doesn't sound to me like a very compelling interest. I don't think it sounds really to anybody like a very compelling interest. And so that is, of course, not the interest when the government's defending one of these bans. That's not the interest it says the ban serves. It says, well, our interest is in preventing gun crime, or our interest is in public safety, or protecting against mass shootings, right? See, it's describing its interest at a much higher level of generality. You know, our interest is in doing good things, in public safety. Now, which of these descriptions of the interest behind the assault weapon ban is the right one? Well, arguably, they're both right. I think many of these governments do think these bans further public safety. I think they're wrong about that, but there's a case to be made that that's the interest they think they're serving. But they're also clearly, the much narrower description of what their interest is also accurate. So how do you pick between the two different descriptions of the interest, one of which is compelling, sounds compelling, one of which clearly doesn't? And the answer is there is no answer. The courts have never provided an answer for how you determine at what level to describe the government's compelling interest in one of these challenges. So it turns out that the entire outcome of the test is going to depend on a question to which there's no principled answer. And the second part of the test asks the court then to determine, once you've figured out or decided on the description of the compelling interest, the court has to figure out, well, is this a necessary means of furthering that interest? Are there other means that could be used to accomplish this interest that would be less burdensome, less restrictive of the constitutional right in question? And that's really a kind of an empirical analysis. So again, in these assault weapon cases, what generally would happen before Bruin is they would come in with their social scientists, right, all funded by Bloomberg, and they would say, oh, there's going to be this many more mass shootings if you strike down this man. We'd come in with our social scientists who would say that's total nonsense because the features that you're banning really have no functional effect on the lethality of these guns. You're not going to have any more mass shootings. And don't get me wrong, I think we clearly have the better of that argument, but it's not a very law-like argument. It's a battle of the social scientists, right? And in a lot of cases, it's not going to be as clear who has the better of the argument. In a lot of cases, and nearly all of the cases that actually go to court, there's going to be some social scientists who say, yes, there are other ways of furthering the interest. There's going to be other social scientists who say, no, there aren't. And it's really beyond the judicial ken. It's not something that you really learn in law school about how to judge between these competing social scientists. So again, I think at the second step, the tiers of scrutiny, the outcome depends on the answer to a question to which there is no principled, objectively verifiable answer. So, as I said at the outset, Bruin rejected the application of these tiers of scrutiny in the Second Amendment context. I think we should celebrate that fact. I think we know, from example, from the 10 years between McDonald and Bruin, where the lower courts generally did apply these types of tests. We know how that went, and it didn't go well for the Second Amendment. We've seen, as Mark said, in the first 90 days after Bruin, things hopefully seem to be going much better, which I think is a mark of the success of the Bruin test in better protecting our Second Amendment rights than the tiers of scrutiny approach ever could. And in closing, these tiers of scrutiny is now clear they don't apply in the Second Amendment context. They do apply throughout the First Amendment context, and they apply in equal protection and some due process challenges. And so in closing, I just want to suggest that for the same reasons that I think we should be very happy that these are not going to water down our Second Amendment rights, if we care about our First Amendment rights, our rights to free speech, free expression, we should really want the court to start to roll them back to the extent it can in that context too, and replace them, maybe slowly at first, but hopefully eventually entirely, with an approach that's, like Bruin, is grounded in the text, history, and tradition of the Constitution. Thank you.
Thank you.